judgment of last year of the Constitutional Court was the culmination of a long battle that involved many cogs in the machine. There were many contributors to the effort. And we now have a situation where the personal and private use of cannabis by an adult has been decriminalized. Of course, a decriminalization is different to a legalization, whereas the one allows a certain type of behavior to simply fly under the radar of the criminal authorities or criminal justice enforcement. The other one, if it was fully legalized, would involve industry, actual regulations, acts which tell you exactly what you can and cannot do in relation to cannabis and in relation to users of cannabis. The judgment was very express that there was still a legitimate state objective that the Constitutional Court felt was served by maintaining a prohibition on the dealing in cannabis. So whatever developments are going to take place, they are only mandated to take place insofar as allowing what the judgment said, which is the personal and private use of cannabis. So ultimately, if a cannabis industry is going to be allowed, that's going to be something that will be decided upon. It'll be a policy consideration by our lawmakers. Having said that, there is the judgment was intended to be interim. It says that it only operates for 2 years, or in the intervening 2 years that we afford Parliament to legislate in order to fill the gap created by the judgment, the order of constitutional invalidity. The Constitutional Court decided not to put any strict definition, firstly, on what amount constitutes personal use, and secondly, what they declined to define was what constitutes a private space. But having said that, there is this bill that's now floating around, and the bill hasn't been published yet, but it seems to have gotten out onto the cannabis networks, and it is a bill that is reactive to the judgment. It doesn't seem to go any further than what Parliament has been mandated to do, but notably what it does do is that it sets certain amounts. I'm not going to go through those, we don't have time, but for example, a person can possess 8 mature cannabis plants. They can possess up to 1 kilogram of dried cannabis product. It also does define what we consider to be a private space, because this has been up in the air for the last few months. What it says is that a private space is any space that the public do not have access to as a matter of right. And then, of course, what a public space is the converse of that. If you have access to it as a matter of right, that's a public space. So that starts getting the juices flowing as to possible private members clubs, or even just a sign on the door that talks about right of admission being reserved, because then you don't have the right to access that as a member of the public without the permission of the establishment owners. It allows for sharing. Those defined amounts are entitled to be shared between individuals, but it's expressed in not allowing dealing. So presumably, if we are going to allow dealing, we're going to require another act altogether, which would be titled something like the Cannabis Industry Bill or whatever the case may be. What hasn't really changed since the judgment is any kind of formalization of, or hasn't changed as a result of the judgment, is the laws related to medicinal cannabis. In terms of Section 22C1B of the Medicines Act, you've actually always been allowed to grow cannabis, but it just didn't seem that anybody knew about this until it became apparent that cannabis was going to be decriminalized. And then all of a sudden, the Medicines Control Council, as it then was, issued these guidelines as to how we're going to plug a law that was never intended to apply to cannabis into the cannabis space, into the medicinal cannabis space. And they released other sorts of guidelines that I won't take you through, related to how to put together a site master file if you were to apply for a cannabis license. But really what the problem with this is that it's onerous and very expensive. It certainly doesn't allow easy access of the poorest in our society to be able to obtain licenses to earn a living off the growing of cannabis. In fact, it seems that it's only really going to be the already rich or the multinationals who are going to be able to get cannabis licenses.